Okay, so picture this, right? It's 1815. The smoke is clearing from a battlefield outside New Orleans. American flag is still there, flying high. Against all odds, you have this ragtag bunch of Americans, pirates, even free black soldiers. And they've just repelled like the might of the British Empire, leading this unlikely victory, Andrew Jackson, a name that would become, synonymous with American grit, determination. You sent in this episode from the History That Doesn't Suck podcast
Right.
about this pivotal moment. And today, we're going deep into the life of Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans.
Yeah, it's a battle that even today, it captures the imagination, not just for the sheer audacity of the American victory, but also because it reveals so much about the character of Andrew Jackson and like the turbulent times that he lived in.
Right. And it's so easy to get lost in the fog of war, so to speak, when we think about these events. But what I found fascinating from this podcast episode was how much was going on behind the scenes, both on the battlefield and in the diplomatic corridors.
Absolutely. And it all starts with the War of 1812 itself. It's often called the Forgotten War, but by 1813, it was clear that neither side was really gaining a clear upper hand. Both the U.S. and Britain were feeling the strain. And there was this growing sense that a negotiated peace was probably the only way out.
So while cannons are roaring in North America, over in Ghent, Belgium, you have these diplomats all huddled together trying to hash out this treaty. And the podcast really brings to life how tense these negotiations were.
Oh, yeah, especially at the beginning. The British initially came to the table with some pretty outrageous demands. I mean, imagine, after essentially fighting to a standstill, they wanted to redraw the border with Canada, taking a huge chunk of Maine. They basically wanted to demilitarize the Great Lakes as if they'd won a decisive victory.
Yeah, I chuckled when I heard that on the podcast. It's almost comical how out of touch they were with the reality on the ground. And of course, the American negotiators, they were having none of it. They insisted on a return to the pre-war status quo, what they called status quo antebellum.
Which essentially just means the state of affairs before the war. It took months of back and forth, waiting on news from the various battlefronts. But eventually, both sides agreed to just kind of hit the reset button. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm hooked. What happened?
The final treaty, the Treaty of Ghent, doesn't even mention impressment, the very issue that sparked the war in the first place.
That is ironic. It really highlights how, the motivations and priorities of nations can shift so dramatically during wartime.
Exactly. And back in the U.S., the war's kind of messy ending. It didn't sit well with everyone. The Federalist Party, already on the decline, they saw the war as a complete disaster. And they held their infamous Hartford Convention to air their grievances. They were worried about the growing power of the South, the war's impact on New England's economy, and they proposed a bunch of constitutional amendments to try and address their concerns.
But, as the podcast points out, their timing couldn't have been worse. By the time they got to Washington, news of the Treaty of Ghent had arrived. Everyone was celebrating peace. The Federalists, they were seen as out of touch, unpatriotic. And the Hartford Convention really marked the end of their influence in American politics.
It's a great example of how events on the battlefield can have ripple effects far beyond the fighting itself, shaping political destinies, reshaping national identities.
And speaking of shaping destinies, no figure embodies the spirit of this era. Quite like Andrew Jackson, the podcast host, he calls him a walking contradiction. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, here's a guy who rose from poverty, orphaned during the Revolution, fought in duels, battled Native Americans, and yet he also had this surprising tenderness, especially towards children, and a strong sense of personal honor. How do you even begin to reconcile these seemingly opposing traits?
Well, what's fascinating about Jackson is that these contradictions, they aren't just quirks of his personality, they reflect the complexities of the time. He's a product of the frontier, a place where violence and chivalry often existed side by side, where ambition and honor were intertwined. You can really see this interplay of violence and honor in the story of Jackson's duel with the Benton brothers in Nashville. The podcast really brings this event to life, describing the tension, the exchange of gunfire, and how Jackson was seriously wounded, carrying a bullet in his body for the rest of his life.
That detail, it really stuck with me. It's like a physical reminder of the violence that shaped him. But it reveals something about his character. He was willing to risk his life to defend his honor, but he carried the weight of that violence with him.
Exactly. It's a reminder that historical figures weren't just, names on a page. They were real people with complex emotions and experiences that shaped their actions. And for Jackson, these experiences on the frontier, the duels, the battles with Native Americans, all of that played a role in forging the man who would become a national icon.
And it's his experience with Native Americans that I find particularly fascinating and troubling, if I'm honest. On one hand, he's known as an Indian fighter, leading American forces to victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. But on the other hand, he adopted a Creek orphan. These seem like completely opposite actions.
It speaks to the complicated nature of Jackson's relationship with Native American, and honestly, the complicated relationship the young United States had with the indigenous populations. It wasn't simply a case of, us versus them. There were alliances, betrayals, moments of compassion alongside acts of brutality, and Jackson embodies this duality. He could be ruthless in war, but he also saw Native Americans as individuals, capable of courage, loyalty, even deserving of his protection.
It's a side of him that often gets overlooked, and it adds another layer to his already complicated legacy. But turning back to the Battle of New Orleans, I'm curious about what drew him to that fight. Was it purely patriotism, or was there something more personal driving him?
Well, you have to remember the strategic importance of New Orleans at the time. It was a gateway to the Mississippi River, a vital artery for American trade and expansion. The British knew that if they could capture New Orleans, they could strangle the American economy.
Yeah.
And potentially even gain leverage in the peace negotiations.
So a vital point for both sides.
Yeah.
And the podcast really captures the atmosphere. In New Orleans, as the British fleet approached, it was a melting pot of cultures, a diverse population that included recent immigrants, free people of color, even pirates. Can you imagine the tension and uncertainty as this powerful British force loomed on the horizon?
It's important to remember that New Orleans wasn't the unified patriotic city that we might imagine today. There were divided loyalties, anxieties about the war, a general sense of vulnerability. But when Jackson arrived, he brought with him a fiery determination and a charisma that seemed to just galvanize the city's diverse population.
The right man at the right time. He didn't care where you came from, what your background was. If you're willing to fight for New Orleans, he welcomed you into his ranks. And this ragtag army he assembled, they faced a daunting task. The British had a massive fleet under the command of Admiral Cochrane, the same guy who bombarded Fort McHenry in Baltimore.
And while Cochrane had failed to capture Baltimore, he was determined to redeem himself at New Orleans. But before he could land his troops, he had to contend with this small American flotilla on Lake Bourne, commanded by Lieutenant Thomas Bixby Jones, or Tack Jones, as he's often called.
Classic David and Goliath story. 5 small American gunboats against more than 40 British warships. Those odds are insane.
But as the podcast details, Tack Jones and his men, they fought with incredible bravery and tactical brilliance. They knew they couldn't win, but they could buy precious time for Jackson to prepare his defenses. They used every trick in the book, harrying the British, disrupting their formations, inflicting surprising casualties before finally being overwhelmed.
It's one of those stories that often gets overshadowed by the bigger battle to come, but it was absolutely crucial to the American victory. Tack Jones's delaying tactics gave Jackson the time he needed to declare martial law, rally the city's defenses, and bring in reinforcements.
And Jackson, never one to shy away from bold action, he immediately seized the initiative. He launched a surprise night attack on the British encampment, catching them off guard, disrupting their plans. A risky move, but it sent a clear message. New Orleans would not be taken easily.
Must have been absolute chaos. Cannon fire lighting up the night sky, soldiers clashing in hand-to-hand combat, sounds of battle echoing across the swamps. And amidst this chaos, there are these incredible individual stories, like that of Major Gabriel Villaret, who had to kill his own dog to avoid being detected by the British, as he rode to warn Jackson of their advance.
It's a heartbreaking story, but it illustrates the high stakes and the lengths that people were willing to go to defend their city. And Jackson, ever the pragmatist, he used the information Villaret brought to further bolster his defenses. Recognizing the strategic importance of the Rodriguez Canal, he turned it into what became known as Line Jackson, a formidable defensive barrier.
The podcast described it as this muddy, ramshackle line of earthworks and artillery manned by this motley crew of militia, regulars, pirates, and free black soldiers, all standing shoulder to shoulder, determined to hold back the British advance. It's an incredible image, and it really captures the spirit of the American defense.
And don't forget the USS Louisiana, anchored in the Mississippi, providing crucial firepower in support of Line Jackson. The Louisiana was the last remaining American warship in the area, and its presence was a constant reminder to the British that they were in for a fight.
But just as things were heating up, a new British commander arrived on the scene. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, and brother-in-law to the Duke of Wellington, no less. Talk about adding pressure to an already tense situation.
Pakenham was a formidable opponent, and he immediately recognized the challenges posed by Lem Jackson. He knew a frontal assault would be costly, so he initially tried to soften up the American defenses with artillery bombardments. But the Americans held firm. He even managed to destroy the USS Carolina with a well-placed hotshot. But the Louisiana remained a threat, and Jackson's defenses held strong.
The tension must have been palpable, as both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be a decisive confrontation. A clash of wills, of strategies, of two nations vying for dominance on the North American continent. And it all came down to this. A muddy field outside New Orleans. What was the overall feeling as we head to the main battle? Sounds like a scene straight out of a movie. Two armies facing each other, across a muddy field, the fate of a city, hanging in the balance. What was Pakenham's strategy going into this final confrontation?
Well, he knew he couldn't just throw his troops at Line Jackson and hope for the best. The American defenses were just too strong. The cost in British lives would have been unacceptable, so he devised a rather ambitious plan, a two-pronged assault designed to outmaneuver the Americans and break through their defenses.
Two-pronged. How did that work?
So the plan involved Colonel Thornton leading a force across the Mississippi River under cover of darkness to attack the American guns on the west bank. The idea was that once Thornton's force had silenced the American artillery, Pakenham would launch a simultaneous frontal assault on Line Jackson. With the American guns out of action, Pakenham believed his troops could overrun the defenses and capture the city.
Sounds like a solid plan on paper. But what happened? Did it work?
Not at all, and the podcast does a great job explaining why. Thornton's force ran into all sorts of logistical problems, trying to cross the river. The canal they'd dug. To make the crossing easier, it collapsed, forcing them to drag their boats over land. These delays meant that Thornton's attack didn't happen at the same time as Pakenham's assault on Line Jackson, throwing the entire British plan into disarray.
So instead of a coordinated attack, Pakenham was forced to attack Line Jackson head-on, without that crucial flanking fire from Thornton's force. Talk about a nightmare scenario. Can you imagine those British soldiers marching towards those earthworks, knowing that the element of surprise was gone, and they were heading straight into a hail of American gunfire?
It must have been terrifying. The podcast quotes eyewitness accounts, describing the fog lifting just as the British advanced, revealing the full extent of the American defenses, and then the American artillery opened fire, cannons roared, muskets crackled, and the battlefield was quickly enveloped in smoke and the screams of wounded men.
The podcast host described it as a scene of absolute carnage. One American soldier recounted that he could have walked
on British bodies
for a quarter mile without touching the ground. It's a chilling image that really highlights the brutality of that battle.
And yet, amidst the horror, there were acts of incredible bravery on both sides, British officers leading their men forward. Despite the devastating fire, American soldiers holding their ground against overwhelming odds, and the free black troops who fought with exceptional courage, proving their loyalty to the American cause.
It's a reminder that even in the most chaotic and violent moments of history, individual acts of courage and sacrifice shine through. But for the British, the attack was a complete disaster. Pakenham was killed early in the assault, General Keane was severely wounded, and thousands of their soldiers lay dead or dying on the battlefield. The American victory was decisive, but at a terrible cost.
And what's truly remarkable is that American casualties were astonishingly low, a testament to the effectiveness of Line Jackson and the tenacity of the American defenders.
It's hard to believe that this ragtag group of Americans, pirates, and free black soldiers, led by a frontier general with a reputation for being, well, hot-headed, managed to inflict such a crushing defeat on one of the most powerful armies in the world. It's a story that really captures the spirit of American resilience and determination.
And while the Battle of New Orleans had no impact on the outcome of the war, the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed weeks earlier. Its symbolic importance was immense. For Americans, it was a resounding validation of their independence, a moment of national unity and pride that helped to heal the wounds of a divisive war.
It's like the entire war, with all its frustrations and setbacks, culminated in this one glorious, albeit unnecessary, victory. And for Andrew Jackson, it cemented his status. As a national hero, his name would forever be linked with the defense of New Orleans and the spirit of American defiance.
His popularity soared after the battle, setting the stage for his eventual rise to the presidency. But, as the podcast hints, Jackson's legacy is far more complicated than this single triumphant moment. His victory at New Orleans is intertwined with his controversial policies towards Native Americans, the expansion of executive power, and the rise of a new, more populist style of American politics.
It's fascinating how one event, this bloody clash on the muddy banks of the Mississippi River, can have such a profound and lasting impact, shaping not just the lives of those who fought there, but the course of American history itself. We started this deep dive talking about the irony of the Battle of New Orleans being fought after the peace treaty was signed. What does this tell us about the nature of war, and perhaps of the human nature itself?
It's a sobering reminder that war is often driven by forces that extend beyond reason and logic. Pride, ambition, fear, the desire for revenge, these emotions can keep a conflict going even when the original reasons for fighting have vanished. And often, it's the individuals on the ground, the soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire, who pay the highest price for these abstract motivations.
It's a lesson that resonates even today. Centuries after the smoke cleared from the battlefield outside New Orleans, you said it's a truly fascinating piece of history to unpack. And I have to say, this deep dive into the life of Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans has been eye-opening. It's a story filled with contradictions, unexpected twists, and enduring consequences that continue to shape our understanding of America's past and present.
And it's a story that invites us to dig deeper, to question our assumptions, and to recognize the complexity of historical figures and events. Jackson, like all of us, was a product of his time, shaped by the forces of history and the choices he made. Understanding his story in all its messy glory helps us understand not just the past, but also the challenges we face today.
Well said. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore further. There's a wealth of information out there, from scholarly articles to historical novels, that can shed new light on this fascinating period in American history. And if you come across something particularly interesting, be sure to share it with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. Because in the end, the best deep dives are the ones we take together.